Okay, well, I think thank you for the introduction. Just a few preliminary notes on my side and regarding this roundtable. As most of you know, DAOs are organized around principles of decentralization, autonomous functioning, transparency, and bottom-up management. And because of their specific features, DAOs pose several challenges when it comes to their regulations. Namely, because when DAOs are not structured or wrapped in a form of a legally recognized entity, it isn't clear which laws would apply to their interaction with the off-chain world, if any. And though the creation of a legal status for DAO could come as a solution for a problem of legal recognition of DAOs, their unique functioning renders it very difficult to outline the main rules that such statute may have. Here to discuss if and how DAOs should be regulated, we have Peter Kerstens, who is an advisor for the financial sector digitalization and cybersecurity at the European Commission's DG FISMA, Nathan Vendy, who is head of DAO at the operator and a PhD candidate at Blockchain Law and focuses his research in the field of blockchain law and governance, and José Nuno Sousa Pinto, who is a Web3 lawyer and a partner of Aragon Association. Thank you all for accepting our invitation and for joining us here in Lisbon. I'm Nuno Sousa, and it's a pleasure to moderate this debate. So starting with Nathan, the first question that comes to mind when discussing DAO regulation is, of course, which challenges in the functioning of DAOs should be tackled by regulations. So what I wanted to ask you is, in your view and according to your experience, what are the main hurdles DAOs face when interacting with the real world?
Thank you so much. I won't go too deep into the different liabilities because they will be discussed throughout the entire conference, as you see from the timetable that we have. But when thinking about liabilities, you usually have to think of them from first, who is liable and what are they liable for? After that, you can also think about how to make them liable and why they're liable. But those are the first two primary questions. And with DAOs, especially with the fact that the definition of what a DAO is and who are the participants in the DAO, we often struggle with ascertaining how to make them take responsibility. You can have quite a narrow view of what a DAO is and maybe look at just the individuals that are holding the token, or you can have quite a wide view of DAOs and look at all the stakeholders involved in the DAO's activities, whether that's governance, whether that's operations. And that usually looks at what jurisdiction is involved in ascertaining the legal recognition of the DAO or the definition of the DAO, and if they actually have laws to define the DAOs. Because in most jurisdictions, they, as said earlier, they see them as unincorporated associations or unincorporated partnerships, and that is a very wide definition. Anyone involved in making the DAO's purpose, the DAO's vision can be included underneath that definition. But once you have certain legal frameworks of how to actually define what a DAO is, or you have a legal entity to actually focus who is involved in the DAO's operations. So, for example, in the Cayman Islands, you can use the foundation structure to specifically outline who is involved in the operations, who is involved in the governance. You can start to get a better understanding of who that liability will be assigned to. So that's one of the biggest issues that DAOs face, like understanding who should be liable first. And, one of the very unique issues with DAOs is the fact that even if you have one jurisdiction that is able to define them, because they are international by nature, one other jurisdiction might not agree with that definition. And therefore, we have that friction there when it comes to liability as well. As I said, I won't go through all the different liabilities because we're going to go through them today, whether it's criminal, tax, fiduciary duties, financial regulations, surveillance. But those are the main issues that I would say that DAOs have to understand when they are structuring.
Thank you. I thought it was interesting that you mentioned that the individuals and participants in the DAO may be held liable, because we see normally that DAOs can have different governance structures, and that normally the tendency is to attribute liability to anyone who can vote on proposal or that even can veto on a certain proposal. And so it is interesting that you mentioned the who and the what for in the liability. So moving on to that, on the question of participant liability in DAO. This is one of the main challenges that the fact that DAOs are not recognized legally face, because counterparty liability can be attributed to participants. What would you say are the most used mechanisms in DAO governance to shield participants from such liability?
Well, thank you so much, Anna. So there's not like one model that fits all. There are different structures that have been set up since probably 2016, 15, from different DAOs. Each DAO is a different case. Each community around the DAO has different purposes, whether it's non-profit, for-profit. What I've been witnessing within this space is that there is an increase on the concern of having a separate entity with autonomous legal personality in order to be held accountable in any case if something happens in engagement with a third party, a contractor. Another in real life entity, a regulator, and so on. So the most common cases of wrappers existing in traditional law till now, from my experience, have been foundations, associations, if there is a non-profit scope of the community, LLCs, if the scope is to have a for-profit a purpose around the community, or even a company. I've been witnessing also that some traditional entities have been using DAOs as a tool, as a governance tool to their existing structure, or even to engage with the community, to hear out the community, but not necessarily to take decisions. So in that case, we were pretty much using LLCs, the company foundations in Cayman Islands, also it's very common for US. I have to say, I'm not very fan of having a separate dedicated legal structure for DAOs. I think the law has been capable of ensuring some certainty for participants in DAOs in order for them to structure in a way that they can engage with third parties and limit their liability in a way. It's very difficult to find one solution that fits all, as I said. What I have been witnessing in other jurisdictions like the US is not more, in my perspective, than the creation of different company entity structures that have been around for ages. So it's not specifically for DAOs.
Especially because of what Nathan also was saying of the jurisdiction which will assert the personality of DAO. The creation of such wrappers can also have that complexity of determining which wrapper would be most appropriate in its jurisdiction. So in order to avoid having to create legal wrappers for DAOs, one of the solutions would be to create a legal statute applicable for DAOs. But there are obviously several challenges when it comes to the enforcement of such statutes. In a recent policy report written by Professor Tarek Rukni on decentralized finance and on the possibility of applying policy frameworks to the DeFi ecosystem, one of the proposals was to identify possibilities of enforcing and incentivizing DAOs to adhere to a voluntary policy framework. Peter, how can this voluntary framework mitigate enforcement challenges in DAO regulation, and what are the advantages of this approach when compared to a mandatory incorporation approach?
Well, that's a good question. Of course, Professor Tarek came up with a suggestion, but the suggestion contained a contradiction, because if it is voluntary, there is by definition no enforcement. There may be a general control as to whether or not the voluntary code is being observed, but it is impossible for any enforcement authority to enforce that against it. But the lack of enforceability does not necessarily mean that it's a bad policy approach, or it may be the least bad among all the other opportunities. The question really comes is that given the problems of legal categorization of DAOs and the diversity of DAOs, is that we are trying our best to fit them into all kinds of legal traditions and legal structures that have developed over decades and centuries. And for all the DAOs that are around there, it really is a square peg in a round hole debate. They fit, or they fit a little bit, but you have to force them in, and it's not a good fit. That then raises the question, well, if they don't really fit, and if you can't really enforce traditional rules, can you do something else? Or should you come up with a separate legal category? We also are considering this, but I agree, it's very hard to come up with a category that fits all the diverse developments. Maybe it's too early, maybe we should see how DAOs develop, and gradually they gravitate around certain typologies, and you can then focus on that. So in the absence of that, there is still the question is that while DAOs have emerged out of this libertarian idea of organization, is that they don't necessarily all do good. They may intend to be to do good, but their behavior or the behavior and the consequences of the group of actors has externalities on society that may be positive, but may also be negative. And if they're negative, society wants to hold people accountable. And how do you do that? Given that you can't enforce the law against a non-entity, against non-person, so Professor Rubin came up with the idea of incentivizing participants in the DAO to voluntarily organize themselves to mitigate and to prevent really societal damage. So it is almost a preventive approach in his idea of say, avoid doing certain things so that no damage occurs. But if we fail to avoid the damage from occurring, there isn't really that much we can do for the time being. Luckily, I'll stop on that, is that there's a lot of talk about decentralized autonomous organizations and policy and discussions, and people say, well, how are we going to regulate this? But from where we sit at the European Commission and looking into these organizations, and I've mentioned this a number of times, that most of the DAOs that we see, most of the representatives of DAOs that come and see us, which I find a bit of a contradiction, because people say, I'm here, I'm going to talk to you, I'm representing such and such DAO. And I said, well, how is that possible? And that's a reflection that they are not really DAOs, but they're dynamos. They are decentralized in name only. It is very much à la mode to say that you're decentralized and that you are a DAO. But if you scratch a bit at the surface, you see that it's not really as decentralized as they present, or that they're using that they are actually a organization more or less centralized that is using decentralizing technologies, that is using these technologies that allow decentralized types of organizations, but they themselves aren't really decentralized, or at least their governance is not decentralized. And so where you talk about diamonds, I don't think you should have a great deal of effort in trying to come up with new regulatory classifications, because you should try to force these people into existing categories. And I think that is possible, even with obligations of incorporation, like, for example, the MiCA regulation was mentioned today. Part of the MiCA regulation, people don't realize it, but it says that if a group, a non-incorporated group, engages in a particular activity, there is an obligation for them to incorporate. That is, of course, aspirational in a way, because if the group fails to incorporate, it can be very hard to enforce the incorporation obligation, because who are you going to force that incorporation obligation on? But depending on the national jurisdiction, you may go after a few people. You say, well, you were involved, you failed to incorporate, we're holding you liable. from national jurisdiction to national jurisdiction where that's possible. So, and that leaves us now with a relatively small category of genuine DAOs that should then submit to this voluntary code of conduct. But you can only respect a voluntary code of conduct if the DAO itself has sufficient organizational control and capacity to commit to the voluntary code. Because how are you going to have a decentralized autonomous organization, which potentially dozens or hundreds of nodes of participants collectively going to agree to commit to a voluntary code, unless the commitment to the code is coded into the smart contracts underpinning it down? But then someone will have to draft those smart contracts, and then you again at the code generators who are centralizing entities who could do that. So it's a great idea, but it's a bit sort of philosophical and not necessarily very practical.
Of course. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the fact that you don't have to rely on the participants' will to adhere to such framework makes it, of course, not an enforcement solution, but a solution that would shield the participants. When you think about it, it kind of reminds us of the parallel with limited liability companies, that if people decide to incorporate a company to benefit from limited liability, that would be an incentive for them to adhere to such framework. And of course, there is also the legal regime where if participants do not respect the legal entity, that the corporate veil can be lifted and they can be held liable. So of course, the adherence to such statute would protect participants from liability. But of course, there is an interesting point that you mentioned, which brings me to my next question, which is, how can participants decide inside a DAO to adhere to such frameworks? Nathan, do you think in order to adhere to such framework, that decision should be a proposal subject to the participants' vote within the DAO?
It's a really great question, and Peter was already alluding to it when he mentioned how can a DAO be decentralized if it has a representative. And well, every DAO begins centralized. There's no DAO that doesn't begin centralized with one founder or developer creating the smart contracts, releasing the governance token, and then afterwards, the decentralization process happens. There's no DAO that begins centralized out of nowhere. Someone has to write that code, sit down on their laptop and do so. Sometimes it's not one person, sometimes it's a group of people. And at the beginning of that process, those group of people who are creating the smart contracts, who are creating the DAO, have an opportunity to set up certain governance and operational frameworks that the DAO can choose to take forward. We're already seeing this now, for example, with the Arbitrum DAO. I'm not sure everyone is following that case, but Arbitrum is a layer 2 protocol on Ethereum, and they created this smart contract framework, this layer, where people can create dApps on, and they wanted to decentralize, right? They wanted to become a DAO that could have recognition, that could be used in one of these frameworks. And they set up a legal structure before they released it. So this goes to your question, right? Like the centralized entity already set up the framework before it was released. And when they did so, they did it without the community's approval, which was quite interesting. And they made a proposal and they said, we are asking for X amount of the treasury based on the work that we've done for setting this up. And the way they phrased it was as if it was a proposal, but they've actually already done it. And of course, this created a massive conflict of interest between those centralized founders, the centralized team, and the DAO that they had set up. If the governance tokens were out there, the DAO can decide on whether to do it or not. And what you saw following was the debacle went to the internet, went to the forums, and the DAO was basically going against all of the things that they'd done to set up the DAO, and said that Now that the DAO is in control, they have to be in charge of the legal and governance structure. They're the ones that have to actually decide how it develops. And this is something that we're going to see quite often. We're going to see this friction between the original centralized founders or developers that they do have good intentions. They wanted to set up this legal structure so that they're protecting themselves and giving the DAO a chance to have a legal entity to have a certain governance and operations. But at the end of the day, once you've released the DAO into the wild, it develops a mind of its own. And in this case, we actually saw the DAO deciding on not necessarily taking all of the legal and governance structures that the initial founders had actually decided on. So I think that's quite an interesting real life use case for us to already see that it will always be the governance token holders, the ones that have control over the assets and operations of the DAO, that will be the ones that decide. How they decide to do so is up to them. Some of them will decide that we want to follow some guidelines. Some might have an operational structure where they appoint maybe a head of law or a legal sub-DAO, which has the competency to decide on behalf of the DAO. But at the end of the day, regardless of what operational structure the DAO decides to have, the governance level and the use of decentralized technology and governance tokens and the holders who are autonomous will decide on the operation structure and whether or not they actually will abide to such laws.
Yes. That's very interesting. And let me just leave a note to the organization. There seems to be a problem with sound. So if anyone could take care of that, because I think people online are hearing this very well. Let me just comment on that example. It is very interesting that the decision itself to adhere to a framework causes friction within the DAO. And also, sometimes we see that participants who submit a proposal, for example, submitting a proposal to adhere to such framework can exit the DAO in case such proposal is not accepted, or participants who vote against such proposal can exit the DAO. So it's also interesting to think about that possibility in this decision to adhere to such framework, where the participants who submit the proposal or want to vote for that proposal can exit the DAO in case the other participants decide that the DAO will not adhere to such framework, and that way it's a way that they will decide whether or not they will be possibly held liable in the future for any damage caused by the DAO. So it's interesting that relationship inside of that. Peter, in the policy report mentioned previously, there is also a highlight on the importance of oracles, either public or private, in helping DAOs comply with regulation, because they are an external source of providing information to the DAO. What are, in your view, the main advantage of public solutions for oracle services when compared to private oracles? Namely, when we think about the liability that can be imposed to oracles.
Well, the assumption is that if the oracle to which the DAO or the smart contract references in order to trigger certain activities, if that's publicly run, that is therefore automatically legitimate and in accordance with the law. Whether it is a good quality oracle is another question, because of course this would suggest that it would be like a public utility, and public utilities come in all kinds of levels of quality. The public sector isn't always the best to provide services. Now, that is a political statement, not necessarily a legal or factual observation, but there is a general problem in decentralized finance and organizational issues generally, is that many smart contracts and DAO activities have independent oracles to which they reference. And negative externalities that may emerge from the DAO behavior are not coming from the DAO, but are triggered by the oracle, because the oracle determines whether or not the smart contract will be triggered or not. And so the issue that emerged really was is what is the liability and the responsibility of the DAO organizers for linking or choosing a particular oracle? Because if they say, well, look, this is the smart contract, and we're going to determine that will be the oracle, they have a responsibility in setting up that structure. The other thing is that if you have to, and even if they did their job with the due diligence, they chose it correctly, while it may be hard or impossible to influence a smart contract, especially if it is very, very decentralized, what we do see is that people starting to attack decentralized organizations, not by attacking the organization, but by attacking the oracle and by triggering the oracle's behavior or manipulating the oracle so that the oracle triggers the smart contract. And Professor Rupke said, well, if you make these oracles public or publicly supervised, that will correct for that. As I said before, this is a report Professor Rupke did. It was very good. It was a big thought piece, but it doesn't necessarily reflect the position of the European Commission. We have some doubts about it, so we published this report to really trigger debate and say, people, we submit these ideas which are sound, which are well considered, to what I would call hostile review in the community to say, people, does this idea that Professor Rupke came up with, does it stand up to scrutiny? Is it a full solution? Is it a partial solution? And so now we're getting feedback, and we see that some of the ideas which he put forward are considered very valuable, whereas others are being criticized a bit. And so he was very right in pointing out the importance of oracles in the entire structure. But the solution he suggested to make these oracles public wasn't necessarily the right solution. But I think it is definitely very important that if you want to regulate DAOs, you don't necessarily have to look that much at the governance of the DAO, but you have to look at the structure and the oracles and how secure, how stable, how independent, how fair the oracle is to which it is linked, and who controls that oracle.
And I think one of the things that was also mentioned in the report was the question, of course, of oracle certification that would help avoid the liability of participants choosing the oracle because it is already certified. In the case of public oracles, there's of course the question of capability, public capability for oracles. And in both cases, either public or private solution, there is also the exposure to cyber risks, to someone, an external source attacking the information of the oracles, which can subvert the system. So this is a question for all of you. Based on the hurdles faced by DAOs when interacting with the option world, what do you think should be the minimum content for DAO legal statute? And should that statute draw any inspiration from existing frameworks? I realize that we can be here discussing this all day, but if we just have preliminary comments regarding that, great.
Well, let me just step back a bit and then just comment on something you said. Of course, there's no such thing as full decentralization, and you can always identify someone that has some sort of control over the protocol, over the structure, over the governance, voting rights, and from a time in which people were offered a hoodie if they deployed the contract, the smart contract, and that was it, because nobody wanted to deploy it. But you still can identify, and there's a path now in order to decentralize big DAOs and big structures that have been centralized for a period of time, and that's the case of Arbitrum, which of course backlashed and then was expectable as well. When they asked so much money to create a legal structure, of course, that will never pass. But I think that it's very, very, very rare that you see a decentralized protocol that has a legal structure approved by default and say, okay, let's go for this legal structure, and then you create a DAO. That never happens. So it's usually it's something that evolves, something's created more spontaneously, and then there's the concern, wait, our treasury is too big for us, shall we pay taxes? So, who is in our community or not? And that's when the legal discussion comes in. I think that having a centralized oracle or a certified oracle is centralization by default. So, and for that, we also have other structures that can do that also. Alternative dispute resolutions, decentralized dispute resolution systems, and so on, that can confer some sort of legal certainty. As what regards to your question, if there's a minimum legal structure for DAOs, I think that everybody involved in DAOs right now understands they should have some sort of legal entity at some stage for some purpose. Whatever that legal entity is, it's up for them to decide in which jurisdiction and for what purposes they're going to use it. If it's to engage contractors, if it's to pay social insurance, it's to social security to contractors, if it is to pay a rental agreement to have an office whatsoever. In those cases, I think it would make sense to have an entity. And then there is another level of discussion, which is what type of engagement does that rapper or will that rapper have with the community? If all of them will be a member of the rapper, if they will choose a delegate, if they'll have an agency model. And I think it's not bad that there are different models for that. I mean, it's not just one imposed solution to be enforced for those DAOs. But yes, I think the bare minimum is to have somehow and somewhere in the structure one legal entity that is approved by the community, like simple majority or so, and is incorporated after strong due diligence in order to comply with some laws.
Yeah,
My opinion.
no, that's good. And yeah, she said it's quite a big topic, understanding of what the bare minimum features of a DAO should be. We started off with a discussion of who even are the DAO participants and how can you define them to assign them liability. And as mentioned, this isn't unanimous, but I take references from the different definitions that have already come from different sources, whether that's self-regulation or law itself. If we look at the Wyoming law, the Wyoming NRC, they've got quite an interesting definition of what the basic fundamentals to get to this legal wrapper, and it's quite whimsical. All you need to be a DAO in Wyoming is to say that you're a DAO. And I think this is a bit too broad. It doesn't give us too much assurances, and as Peter said, it does attract more of the DINOs, the decentralized and name only, rather than those that actually have features of a DAO. And then another definition, which I think is a little bit more closer, or another law that's been created, is a self-regulatory model law by Koala, the DAO model law. And over there, the base that they look at is that there's decentralization on a technical level. So the organization has released smart contracts that it can refer to on a blockchain, and that blockchain has to be public and permissionless as well. And I think that's quite an interesting place to start as well, because it's on the other spectrum of having no features at all. And it also allows for the process of progressive decentralization, because not all DAOs, when they start, will be decentralized in governance and operations. As mentioned earlier, a lot of them start with a founder or a team, and they need to eventually pass on that power to the community. So I like that definition as well. But I do think that for us to reach that stage of sufficient decentralization, there needs to be this middle ground where you're using the technical decentralization technology. You're using public permissionless blockchain to release your DAO. You've got this mission to be sufficiently decentralized, and there's a roadmap to get to that decentralization as well. So there's the path to decentralization where every period, whether that's a quarter or annual basis, you show that you've made progression towards that being the case. And the reason why this is important is because, for example, if you use the DAO model law and you show that you're technically decentralized, but then you have a lawsuit, and then you find out that you're a DAO and you're only decentralized in name only, and your operations, the governance aren't decentralized, then it makes sense for the laws that are applied to you to be very different than the laws that are applied to a DAO that's actually decentralized or on the path to becoming decentralized. And so those are the two places that I'm looking at. I'm looking at the technical decentralization, and if you're not sufficiently decentralized yet, you're at least, you've got a roadmap, you're making progress towards that being the case.
I think that's a very good way of looking at it, because the entire debate about these DAOs started, as Vitaly Buterin said, it's you've got the technology in the middle and the people and the organizations around it. And so you have to look at the use of the technology layer rather than the organizational structure around it. Now, as to the question as to what are the minimum features, legal features of a DAO, I think it's an impossible question to answer, because it depends very much on the perspective you hold. Do you want to define the minimal legal features for the purposes of attributing or defining liability, criminal liability, civil liability, contractual liability, extra-contractual liability? Okay, if that's your perspective, the attribution of liability, you're going to be looking for certain features. But if you take the perspective of, say, a policymaker, a financial regulator, I mean the financial regulation, you're going to say, well, what are the minimum legal and organizational features that I would like to see in a DAO so that I can apply financial and prudential regulation to them. But if you are in a different policy, trade law and so on, you'll be looking at different features, because you're looking for the features that you are, that enable you to attach your area of the law to. And the law is very, very wide. So if you want to have the minimum legal features that you can hook all the perspectives onto, you're basically going to end up with, sorry, you need to be incorporated. Because otherwise, it's always going to be impossible to apply one or the other perspective. And that's the question that you can say you need to be incorporated. But given that a DAO is a non-entity, how can you enforce the obligation to incorporate on them? Because in order to enforce such an obligation, you need to identify the people behind it. And there's a lot of examples given of DAOs, and often I say, well, there's a problem here. They're either decentralized, but they're not an organization, or they're an organization, but they're not decentralized, or they're not autonomous. So the term is decentralized autonomous organization. But actually, I have yet to come across a thing that actually meets all three elements in an equal sense. The only one, or the one which comes closest to my personal perspective, is actually the Bitcoin community. But the Bitcoin community scores very low on the organization dimension. They're not organized. They are very decentralized. They're very autonomous, but they're not particularly organized. And so if you want to have a DAO where the three elements are kind of more or less in equilibrium, I haven't come across them yet. They may not exist. They may be unicorns. They may be unicorns. Everyone talks about them. Everyone knows what they look like, but no one has ever seen one.
It's super interesting that you say that, because at the end of the day, it's a spectrum, right? Decentralization is a spectrum, and it's a balance. You have a trade-off between decentralization and operational efficiency. The more decentralized you become, the more people you have to ask on to get things done, the less efficient you're going to be. And at the end of the day, DAOs are startups. A lot of them release their tokens because they want to create a business. They want to create a way of bringing value to people that people are willing to pay for it. And the more decentralization that you have at the start, the less likely you are going to be able to pivot to be able to actually create a sustainable revenue. And that's one thing that we have to be completely aware of, because sometimes we often fetishize this decentralization to the point where we forget about the point of creating a business in the first place, which is to actually bring sufficient value. We care more about decentralizing data away before actually finding that product market fit. And this is why when creating the understanding of how we should frame DAOs from a policy perspective to actually bring as much value as possible, having that baseline of just focusing on that technology feature and saying, okay, eventually we're going to find our product market fit, and then we're going to give more and more power to the community on deciding how this develops, is the best way to get the best of both worlds, for us to create value in the system and create value which is owned on a public, permissionless and global level.
Very interesting points. It's interesting that the question of the legal concept of DAO and how could that mean different things for different areas, because we really do see that on the daily basis. For example, concepts of tax law and corporate law do not necessarily coincide. And I will just, one last question, because we are approaching the end of the roundtable. What will be the feature if we do create a legal statute for DAOs? Do you think that DAOs will have to be forced to leave certain qualities in order to fit into that statute? Would they sacrifice decentralization, for example? And do you think that will be an incentive for them to adhere to a voluntary framework, or will the principles which initially underpinned the creation of DAOs prevail? And is there a case for self-regulation of DAOs through, for example, a legal wrapper for some part of the operation of DAOs, dispute resolution mechanism? Do you think there are alternatives? What are the pros and cons between such a structure and voluntary adherence to legal statute? You can also stay here
Yeah, first of all, of course, identifying the members. So having some accountability to participants in the DAO is something that many DAOs struggle trying to identify bad actors, AML procedures. That's something that moving forward, that should be something that should be sacrificed within the space, also to bring some accountability to its participants. Then, of course, paying taxes on the treasury and how they spend, regardless of the this is usually a difficult subject to discuss in DAOs, because they think they are above the law and they don't need to comply with any type of regulation. I think these two main characteristics, which are not by default architectured in DAOs, in the participation of DAOs. Many people hide under their anon profiles in order to participate in those DAOs, and they might have some control also of the governance of the treasury and so on, and that needs change. So I think some enforcement on AML, it's important. Just one note on what Peter was saying, I completely agree with you and what this definition of DAOs is. I think my perspective, we're talking more about decentralized, automated entities. They're not autonomous at all, and the criteria of decentralization is something vague. I think we are doing, enormous progress on that. And there are kind of some definitions in which, if you deploy the protocol and you don't have the control of pulling it back at some point, then it becomes autonomous. But we haven't come to that yet. That will change with AI in the future, mostly on DeFi. And I'm very keen to see how that's going to deploy also in the future. But I agree, it's more like automated, not so much autonomous. But there's a long, on your question, I think there's a long path ahead for accountability on DAO participation right now that needs to be embedded in the whole concept of DAO participation.
Yeah.
On sort of self-regulation, the question really is, does every DAO have its own code of conduct, and does the community of that DAO determine collectively what those rules are they voluntarily are going to adhere to, sort of their philosophy, their mandate, or is it the people who set up the DAO that are going to make a proposal and people vote on it, or can this code be, the self-regulatory code be amended, or is it a collective self-regulatory code? I have no idea who could possibly write it or develop it, to which then individual DAOs, as they emerge, say, well, we're going to abide by that. Because people said the European Commission should propose a code of conduct. We said, well, that's not really our business. If we do a code, it will be law. We'll propose it as law, and it will be compliant. But we're not in the business of writing general principles and then for people to voluntarily adhere to, because the community has to do that themselves. But what can such codes possibly say beyond do no harm, be nice, don't act illegally? So, yeah, often, yes, indeed. The thing is that a lot of these organizations, these representatives that come and see us say, we are fully compliant. I said, no, that's not. There's no credit for that. You have to be fully compliant. And I said, you're fully compliant with what? And I said, well, we're fully compliant with AML law. I said, well, good for you. But there's so many other things. So it's an extraordinarily difficult question. And the only thing DAOs can do is to aspire and to organize themselves so that they are compliant with general principles of law. But the more they become either decentralized or autonomous, the less control they have to ensure that this compliance will be guaranteed. I think it is very, very difficult to have an autonomous organization, an autonomous disorganization, because the more disorganized, the more decentralized they become, the more disorganized they become, to then maintain a respect of something which is centrally coded. And that goes back to the fact that this technology is really a development of a very libertarian idea. And I'm not against libertarianism, but that's basically it. It is set up in such a way as to avoid centralized control. And then the entire debate, legal debate, is how can we impose centralized control and centralized legislation onto something that's developed with a view to escape this. So it's very philosophical.
Yeah, it's really, really interesting. And yeah, coming back to the question of the debate, should DAOs be regulated, have self-regulation, or have no regulation? One of the contexts that I really like to take into consideration is that right now we're living in a world where we have a lot of international technology organizations, right? We have our Metas, we have our Apples that exist over multiple jurisdictions, and they have to deal with multiple compliance frameworks of all of these jurisdictions. And even these big organizations aren't compliant in every single jurisdiction. There's a lot of times where they have to do a risk assessment and say, okay, in this jurisdiction, the law hasn't developed in data protection for us to understand how to move forward, or us compliant in this jurisdiction makes us non-compliant in this jurisdiction. How do we take the cost-benefit analysis of the fact that there's no alignment internationally in data protection law? And so as we become more international, as we become more global, there's naturally going to be these conflicts that exist between different jurisdictions about how to apply law. It's even worse when you get to things like tax law, as you were mentioning. because tax law is an area of law where people need to cooperate to a certain extent, but they don't want to because they want to be able to get as much money as possible from all of the different international organizations.
All countries want to collect.
Exactly.
They all say they want to collect taxes in our international protocols. Yeah.
Precisely. So that's the context that I first look at when understanding how to figure out whether we should be regularized, self-regularized, or have no regulation. And then the second context is the fact that, of course, as we've been saying, DAOs are international from the get-go. And the fact that they're international from the get-go, it means that they have all of these international laws that the founders or the coders have to understand from the beginning when they release their technology. And if the lawyers that are working in this space don't understand all of the laws, how do we expect the founders to? So we do need an area where it's safe for these founders to release their technologies in the beginning. We do need a level of regulation, but as Peter said, we need a combination as well. So we need some self-regulation where DAOs are able to create best practices themselves, where the industry is able to combine the experience, combine the litigations we've had to suffer with Ripple, OKDAO, bring the lobbying that organizations such as INAPA has been doing, and we have organizations in the US and other places moving forward. And then also use those experience in lobbying and litigation to make sure that legislation gets better, the regulation that we have gets better as well. And eventually we'll get to a place where there's no regulation, for example, with sufficiently decentralized organizations such as Bitcoin, where you can't look to see who is running the Bitcoin network and say, you're the representative of Bitcoin DAO, you're responsible for any of the breaks in financial laws that happen. And I think that's how I see it anyway. We don't need one of these modes of regularization. We need all regulation. We need all of them to work cohesively, so we create the best environment for us to actually make DAOs great again.
Thank you all so much for your views. I think we are coming to the conclusion that regulating DAOs is actually figuring out how we look at decentralization from a regulatory perspective, from a regulation perspective, and that will lead us to the next roundtable. But thank you so much. I think we have food for thought for the rest of the day. Thank you all.
Thank you.